It's so nice to have you all here this evening, Pacific time and East Coast time. And we have Ewan from Sri Lanka. We have people from Canada. We have East, West Coast, all over the country. And it's really lovely to see people come together and share really the most important things in our lives. So it's a blessing that we could all be here tonight together. And I'm especially excited to have three guests. Doug Phillips is a koan teacher at the broader Pacific Zen School. And in the late 1970s, he began meditation with Maureen Stewart. And then she died about 1990. And he took up Vipassana meditation with Larry Rosenberg, and who was influenced partly by Korean Zen, and studied with him for quite a while, got transmission from him in 2003, and then picked up koan meditation once again, more formally. So he did some Zen, Vipassana, Zen, with James Ford, who is directly of the Pacific Zen School, and gained transmission from him in 2017. And since then, Doug has been a teacher co-teacher and leader of the Empty Sky Sangha in Lexington and Connecticut. Susan is an author of 6 books, so 3 of which are on mindfulness meditation. She co-founded the Center of Mindfulness and Compassion at Harvard Medical School and Cambridge Health Alliance, and for 10 years served as president of the Institute of Meditation and Psychotherapy there. She runs a private practice. She is a licensed psychotherapist, trained classically, and practices in Cambridge and writes quite a bit. In fact, she writes a blog for Psychology Today, and it's called The Art of Now, Essential Skills of Mindfulness, and is currently studying koans primarily in the white plum Asanga tradition, but it's very close. That's essentially the same tradition as our own. And then Ewen Arnold worked for some decades as an English as a foreign language teacher in all over the world, England, Ethiopia, Oman, Sri Lanka, and also was a teacher of master diver instructor in Oman. In 1997, he traveled to Nalambe Buddhist Meditation Center in Kandy, Sri Lanka, where he lives now. And he became a student at that time of Godwin Samaran Ratne. And Godwin passed away in 2000. And at that time, Ewan traveled a bit to other Indian Buddhist schools, and then returned to Nalambe in Kandy in Sri Lanka. And since 2017 has served as a Vipassana teacher of foreign students, and he joined Pacific Zen as a koan student in 2020 after some 5 years before that, coming across John Terra's book, Bring Me the Rhinoceros, which is a classic in Zen koan study. So let me start with you, Doug. How'd you get into this business anyway?
Well, when I was in high school, we had a judo club, and the teacher was talking about Zen as a part of our judo practice. And I lived in Columbus, Indiana, and was able to find one book in the library uh, by Trevor Leggett called Zen and the Ways.
Yeah, good book too.
Yeah, it was love at first bite. I immediately fell in love with the culture, with the art, with the practice. Um, Actually didn't formally learn how to meditate until I think a junior in college. And I was studying in the East Asian Languages and Literatures department at Indiana University, and was studying with a guy named Kenneth Yasuda. And Ken wrote one of the first academic books on haiku in English. And he had lived in one of the internment camps during the war. And he'd learned a form of meditation there. And so that's what he taught me. And that's what I practiced for years. And then was introduced to Maureen Stewart and practiced with her for a number of years until she died. And John Kabat-Zinn sent me then to George Bowman and Larry Rosenberg. They both trained with Sung San Sunim, the Korean Zen master from Providence, Rhode Island. And George was Sung San's first Dharma heir. And I saw both of them for interviews. They were old friends. So they took me on, and I sat sesshin with George and insight retreats with Larry. And that continued until George left town. And I was all in with Larry at that point. And at some point, was teaching with him. He and I co-led retreats at the Insight Meditation Society and a couple of other places. And eventually I was on my own and ran into James Ford. And James and I were just hanging out, having lunch on a number of occasions. And I said to him, we were walking back to his church, and I said, James, I think I want to start up my koan practice again. And as we stepped off the curbing into traffic, he said, great, what's Mo? And we went on from there. Um, and
Excellent, excellent, excellent. Susan, how about you? You're on mute, dear.
Yeah, there we go. Um, I had a rather eccentric childhood, which was certainly colorful. So still have, she's in her 90s now, an aunt who lived in New York City who was a journalist. And she was sent on assignment to cover about the first ashram that opened up in New York City, which was run by Swami Satchidananda. And I think I was probably about 10. So my brother and I were visiting her for Christmas. She took us to meet Swami Satchidananda, and I was just blown away. I was from a fairly, straight-laced suburban childhood, and here were people dancing and singing and incense, and Swami Satchidananda appeared with his flowing beard and white hair, and I was taken. And my aunt, being the good journalist she was always interested in the next new story. So whenever I came to visit, it was like, oh, you have to meet Krishnamurti, or Ram Dass is in town, or, there was like the parade of the gurus of the 70s. And it stuck for me. And but my first home in many ways was Zen. Long, lovely story, but when I was 15, a friend took me on my first session with Philip Kapleau. And that really turned my head around, and I became very, very interested in Zen and continued on Zen, then went into the academic study of religion, and then again in the 60s and 70s there was one scandal after another, and I'm sure a lot of people know this as well. And when I was in graduate school, I found Cambridge Insight Meditation Center and also studied with George Bowman Doug, and I realized that we've been living parallel lives for decades. And it felt like a place that where I could settle. It wasn't exciting, but it was solid. Um, so I stayed there, studied there, watched more scandals come and go, which then got me very interested in therapy, because I was seeing all this trauma from people who've been abused in one way or another, and then became very interested in trauma and became a trauma psychologist. And also, it wasn't like there were many jobs in the academic study of comparative religion anyway. But so what happened in terms of I came back to Zen because around COVID was going through a family life crisis, illness, and I kept thinking of the line from Auden, um, which is about suffering. The old masters were never wrong. And I thought, okay, where do I go here? And I turned to Dogen. I was studying at the New York Zen Center, started studying Dogen, um, deeply studying Dogen, which then led to the study of koans. And for me, the koans like just grabbed me. I know Joan Sutherland jokes that koans come to fetch you. And I felt like they were and they still are fetching me.
Hmm. Nice, nice. You, and how about you?
My it keeps telling me my internet is unstable, so I hope you can hear me. Yeah. Um,
It's probably natural in Sri Lanka, isn't it? Ewan's
it is
calling in
these
from
days.
Sri
Yeah.
Lanka, so.
We have loads of thunderstorms here at the moment, so it comes and goes. Um, I was teaching in Saudi Arabia people who didn't want to learn what I had to teach, going through a very messy divorce, drinking far more than was good for me, although it seemed like a good idea at the time. And I came on holiday to Sri Lanka. And I stepped off the train in Kandy and met somebody who I worked with in Saudi who was here before me, Tony, and said, where's the pub? Um, and he said, you must meet this meditation teacher. And I kind of gave him a look and said, come on, Tony, don't joke around. And we headed off to Nalambe Buddhist Meditation Center. I dropped my bags off, and Godwin Samaratna had set it up and was there. And there was something about him that yeah, I can tell the story as a story of I've really found something that I needed. There was something about him. He seemed so peaceful, and very difficult to put your finger on it. His sense of humor was amazing. He could laugh at himself in a way that I've never met anybody else who can laugh at themselves in the way he could. And I stayed for a while, and every time I came back to Sri Lanka, my wife, who I met on the same holiday in the same week, um, uh, she she would go and stay with her family, and I would go to the meditation center, and it was horrible. It was really difficult, and yet I kept going back. And then, I mean, I when we got the chance, my wife and I came here to live. One of the main reasons was to be near the meditation center. It's just up the hills behind me here from where I live.
Um,
I've I've
mhm.
yeah,
Yeah, please,
I
please.
read
Yeah.
what I read widely, and he was very eclectic. It wasn't really, although Sri Lanka's a Theravada country, it wasn't really the Theravada tradition. He'd read Zen and various other things as well. I was reading a tricycle one day a few years ago, and there was something from John Tarrant in there, and it was different from anything I'd ever read before. And I got Bring Me the Rhinoceros, started doing koan work by myself without a teacher or anything. And then when COVID happened, I had the chance of starting doing retreats, which is what I did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, nice, nice. And it's been so nice to have you remotely all this time. Uh, Doug, what you probably, as much as anyone on this panel, have worked with both Vipassana and students with Vipassana and Koans. How would you characterize Vipassana practice, which you have interpreted as I think seeing clearly. Is that right? And koan practice, the public cases. Um, how would you how would you characterize the differences there and similarities?
That's a really big question, John. Um, there are many lineages that use Vipassana. I mean, Vipassana means seeing clearly into the nature of things. And there are many approaches to that. In Burma and Thailand, what we've done here in America. For me, one of the things that stands out as a useful difference with using koans is their performative aspect. One of the things that I've noticed is it really pulls deeply for how people feel about themselves, how they feel in the relationship with a teacher when they're working with a koan. Um, Feelings
So
of,
when you say they're performative and they pull deeply, for example, what could
well,
be an
for
example of that?
example, Joan Sutherland says the two most feared words in Doksan are "show me,"
Hmm.
and yeah, right. And it you find shame, you find embarrassment, as well as joy and creativity and interest. Great doubt, I think, as often as not, is about self doubt and how that gets refined and intensified in the work with koans. Um, One of the
And you would not encounter that necessarily in Vipassana.
Well, I certainly didn't. I mean, if you're working deeply with a teacher, I mean, I really had an apprentice relationship with Larry, so it was really hard to hide from him. And I think that in any practice, it's easy to hide. With Zen, it's there are places we can hide out. For example, if we're really good, quote, good with koans, we can come in and go through koan after koan after koan, and there's a lot that gets missed there. In Vipassana, you can have deep absorption states. You can be really clear about overcoming the so-called hindrances and miss a lot. So I do think that koans, because they ask you to show your understanding, are different than what we have in Vipassana. Uh, an example would be how we work with the hindrances, the so-called hindrances in Vipassana. There's an approach that says we have to overcome, we have to conquer boredom, irritability, anger, um, loginess, sleepiness, etc., rather than wondering what those are, rather than taking those as invitations. They're often seen as things to overcome. Um, Inquiry can be used in very similar ways in Vipassana and koan work, but it can also be very different.
Hmm. 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 Susan, how about you? How do you see the differences and similarities of Vipassana and koan meditation?
Well, first I want to say I'm relatively new. I have beginner's mind with koans.
Perfect.
Starting um, starting there, but Doug, I do want to pick up on your comments on shame, which I think certainly um, is so powerful, and also performance anxiety. So I know it was probably my first year or so, I felt like I was having performance anxiety every time. And I mentioned that to teachers, like, oh, everybody has performance anxiety. And I thought, oh, that's so interesting. And I feel like I'm almost going through different stages, and that I've been doing koans enough in that they don't terrify me quite as much as they used to. And they're sort of shifting to a sense of joy and playfulness. And Doug and I were sort of chatting during the week, and it turns out our paths have crossed with similar teachers probably for 35 years. And we've never really met. And we maybe live, what, 15, 20 minutes away. So it was like, this is strange. But I was saying, okay, so how do you understand sort of the psychological mechanism of this? Like, why is it why is it working? Why is it healing? And I know in JJ's class, the past few classes, I felt an enormous sense of joy and playfulness and happiness that was persisting. And I mean, I'm a serious Vipassana student, but rarely do I get joy and, happiness a day after class or, a week after class. Um, and one of the things I've been thinking about, there's a wonderful British psychoanalyst pediatrician named D.W. Winnicott who wrote a lot about child development. And one of the things he really wrote about was how we need to play, and how if we don't play, the child will get depressed, and how the parents need to play with the child, and how play is lost with parents as well. And I thought, oh, I wonder if we're playing again. I mean, in Open Temple, we were, doing these rather fun koans where, people would fall down. Um, and like, how often do we let ourselves fall down without shame? And I find other koans have gone very deeply in that I will dream about them, or they'll almost speak to me. I know that we had a recent koan in Open Temple, which was so powerful. We were talking about, the Buddha sitting, and someone was, this needed to be the racehorse, the first horse. And I thought, this is really unwinding decades of conditioning. And you know what? I don't need to be the first horse anymore. I don't even need to have a horse in this race. So I feel like it's sort of reworking childhood issues in healthy ways.
Hmm.
So,
Hmm. Hmm. Thanks. So, Ewan, how about yourself? These, sames and differences. I know in your teaching, you're beginning to very stealthily introduce koans in talking to you over the last month and two.
Um, before before Susan spoke, I wrote down the word play. Um, my first teacher was very playful. As I said, he had a great sense of humor, and yet Vipassana is often not taught like that. I spent some time in Bangalore, at a place in Bangalore where um, it occurred to me while we were on a 28-day retreat, um, and what was happening was the teacher was shaping our experience by the questions that he asked and the way that he approached things. So after we'd been sitting in meditation, everybody would stay in the hall, and the teacher would, who was a monk, would ask individual people to talk about their experience, and there was definitely a right and a wrong answer. Um, and gradually, as he went around the room, people's answers became more similar to the right answer. Um, and one of the things that highlights for me is one of the differences. A lot of Vipassana is goal oriented. You're trying to get somewhere, you're trying to achieve something, you're trying to um, see clearly the characteristics of existence. And um, one of the things I love about Zen is it's not goal oriented, there's no destination. Um, another difference, although it doesn't have to be taught like that, of course. My first teacher didn't teach like that at all. Um, um, Hiding. There's I've one of I meditated on. I did anapanasati, which is mindfulness of the in and out breath, for 12 years when I started learning meditation, and I realized one day that I was going back to the breath in my meditation to avoid things that were arising. I was hiding, and I find it much harder to hide um, in the PZI Zen tradition when I'm with you, John, or um, in small groups and so on. I don't. I think one of the things there is it's the PZI tradition I've found is absolutely non-judgmental. In Vipassana, they talk about not judging, but because there are no wrong answers, no right answers, no wrong answers. One of the things John Tarrant says is you can't do it wrong. Because you can't do it wrong, or because I can't do it wrong, I feel I can say what is actually happening and what is going on. And that's really liberating. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah,
I'd like to
yeah.
say,
Please jump in, Doug.
because what you said, you had triggered something for me. Um, Much of this is different lineage expressions. If you look
Mm,
at some of the old Thai forest, the pictures of the old Thai forest masters, they are
Yeah.
incredibly severe looking and gaunt. And there's a whole strain of Theravadan practice. I'm a little ginger about using the word vipassana because it only means seeing clearly into the nature of things.
Yeah,
And
my teacher, to jump in, Doug, my teacher used to say Vipassana is an outcome, is the outcome of practices. It's not a practice.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah. And there's also real humor. Now I think Zen has a real tradition of humor that
yeah,
maybe the Theravadan lineages don't have. But Larry Rosenberg is a stand-up comic, and one of the things that I learned early on, both as a psychologist and psychotherapist, as well as a meditation teacher, is that any time that I have a session or an interview that laughter is not a part of it, it puts me on alert. That these whether it's teacher student, therapist client, the whole richness of an interpersonal relationship is what we welcome into the room. And if what we're doing technically, whether it's with koans or anapanasati or whatever mantras, whatever it is, if we're not alert for what we're excluding from the room based on what we think ought to happen in the room, there's a problem. And so, how do we as teachers and therapists stay alert to that, nimble? I think the people in the other chair will tell us about that in one way or another pretty regularly if we're really listening. So,
yeah, I find in working with students, often we'll be chatting, how's things going, and then we jump into the koan, and we find that the koan is directly reflecting, that which we had previously talked about. And even Alison Atwell, one of our teachers, she says, you go into the Doksan room and it's impossible not to be expressing the koan. Everything you do is expressing the koan. And that brings up the point that you made, Susan, about performance anxiety. And I think that must be a barrier for a lot of people in studying koans, this feeling like you don't want to expose yourself, but that's what we're doing all the time anyway, right? So we might as well expose ourselves in this safe place, in a sense, in this place of play. And that's the rich work, I think, and the satisfying work. Yeah. One thing, insight meditation, insight, and we've had discussions in this forum in the Luminary series about Yamada Koan's school, which was in Kamakura, and which our schools, so many of the schools in the United States, the Koan schools usher from, including the White Plum Sangha, including Kapilo, including Pacific Zen and the Diamond Sangha and others. And the criticism of Yamada Koan's place for some people was that it was a Kensho factory. It was Ken means to see and Sho means to light. So, in other words, it was just trying to make people enlightened or, have some experience and then move them along, and then next person, this factory-like quality. I think that's pretty unfair, actually. But at the same time, yeah, Kensho is a thing. There is seeing the light is Vipassana, right? So I wanted to ask you, from your guys' experience, and jump in any order, what, as far as you can tell, is the difference between a Zen Kensho, a Chan Zen Kensho, and perhaps a Theravada or a Vipassana or a mindfulness meditation Kensho, seeing the light? Indeed, if there is that experience in that, or if they even care about that.
Well, I've had experiences, and Doug, I don't know if you've had similar ones, where at least with clear seeing, you're supposed to stay very sober and grounded. And, if you're walking around sort of like that, someone will sort of say, focus on your feet. And I'd had a brief experience with Sufism, and I loved the ecstasy and the joy and the music. And, at Cambridge Insight Meditation Center, you sort of don't do that. So with, again, beginner's mind with the koans, I have felt that it was okay to have breakthroughs, and no one was telling me, to settle down, that I could just have this wonderful sense of ecstasy. I mean, the Open Temple koan this week last week has been on just the beautiful blade of grass with Indra, and how amazing to go outside. It's just winter here, and sometimes the blade of grass is covered with tiny ice crystals, and it's just gorgeous. And I felt like that beauty is more allowed in Zen, both with the art and the poetry.
Yeah, John, when you asked that question, I'd be interested in what Susan and Ewan think about this. The question came up, can there be different kinds of clear seeing? Or is clear seeing clear seeing? And, I think when I hear, well, there's Vipassana insight and there's Zen insight and there's Jogsen insight, and it's like, I just find that confusing. It doesn't make sense to me in terms of my experience. And then where that follows for me is, somebody comes in and they've had a real opening. I'm interested in that, but I'm also interested in
so somebody comes into your Doksan room and they've had a real opening. What are they telling you? What are they doing, Doug?
I think it's different with every person, John. You know that. I mean, they could be lit up from the inside. They could talk about, this sense of oneness where things fall away. How it gets talked about is somewhat variable. I'm interested in that, but I'm really interested in, okay, what now? I mean, somebody comes in and says they had intimacy with the falling leaves. I'm going to be interested in, well, what's intimate for you now?
mm,
And I'm going to even be more interested in how does this affect how you're actually living?
mm,
Mhm.
You know, because for me, this is about looking at how we're actually living and learning from that. And the koans certainly support that. The clarity of seeing certainly supports that. But if that's not being realized in my relationships, I don't see the point.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Ewan, you have any thoughts on that, or
It's not it's not something I think about. It's not something I don't tend to think uh, in those ways anymore. There, when when people had insights, if I remember in the Vipassana tradition, I remember talking to someone else in the meditation center about something that happened to me, and the answer from everybody there, including the teacher, was kind of. We don't kind of talk about these things. You know, you can kind of talk about it with your teacher, but in some way, I don't know. It was taboo in some way to talk about um, uh, things like that. Um, and I'm much more interested in the last thing that Doug said in how does it affect my life? How does when I talk to students when I'm teaching one to one, how you know what's happening in their life, what what are they doing in their practice? Is there a relationship between those things? Um, how can how can we talk about these things together? How can we learn together from what's happening?
mm, mm,
So um, and it comes back the thing I said before as well. There were definite in some of the traditions of Vipassana. There were definite you had to have certain kinds of experiences, and then you moved on to another kind of experience. There's nothing like that in Zen, and again, that's freeing in the PCI Zen anyway.
mm.
Um, all experiences are kind of equal in some way, worth talking about. Um,
Yeah,
with the
yeah.
teacher.
We sort of take Kensho and awakening for granted. I mean that it's going to happen. You're going to be opening up and you're going to be working with koans, and we do spend tremendous amount of time. And I think this is partly why you know um, Doug has joined PZI over the years is how do you bring that into your life? So I know in Japan I spent 8 years in Japan with Yamada Koun and it was very Japanese, even though it was a lay zendo and it wasn't one of these hard ass monasteries. Uh, there was it's inescapable Japanese culture, and Yamada would see 60 people a day in Doksan in a retreat, and you had about 2 minutes. You couldn't talk about your relationship, with your daughters or your partner or something. There just wasn't time, nor was there the cultural proclivity. He didn't really want to care. He didn't really care. He just wanted you. He wanted the classical answer for no or moo, and you would keep going back until you got that classical answer. And I'm actually not critical of that because I think that within that context, something was working and has worked in Japan for 1200 or 1300 years. But I think there is that quality of transferring. I don't know if transference is the right word, but transferring that light across cultural barriers. And then within that, it seems to me there are the differences of the schools, and I think Pacific Zen, largely because of John Tarrant and I think his deep confidence in awakening, has allowed us, to be, I think, a little freer, in the way we approach it. Talk about play a little bit more, talk about the arts, a little bit more, talk about your life. But when you were talking, Doug, it made me think of the word intimacy, not knowing is most intimate. Um, this quality of intimacy. And I think, and the question comes up for me, how can you not be intimate with your koan if you don't bring in every aspect of your life, including all the dark bits, right?
Yeah, and I think that includes asking questions like, "Are you fighting with your wife less?"
That's the vessel for
And
your
then,
awakening, right?
and on top of that, can I talk to your wife or your husband to verify that? And I'm really out on a limb here because I think my wife is on the Zoom right now. So can we move along now?
Hi, Adrian. I think it's me. Welcome, welcome.
But
You,
there's that right there. There is that piece.
yeah,
When we ask people, so where does a stone crypt show up in your life?
yeah.
Where does falling down a well show up in your life?
Mm.
And who are you doing that with? Are you doing it less often? Are you able to get out sooner? I think those are not typical Doksan questions that historically, right? I mean, you got 2 minutes to talk with your teacher. You're not going to have time to work through that. And I think when Zen came over to the States or to the West, that was a significant piece that led to the kinds of scandals that occurred here because there was so much that was quote unquote bypassed and so much that was repressed that it had to come out somehow, and it did.
Yeah, I think there was a lot of painting by numbers, and I think
Mm.
there was a lot of, frankly, male dominance. And now there's a lot of women are at least more than half of, our sangha, a vast number of leaders. And it's just a completely different, you
Yeah.
know, cultural milieu than it was when Japanese Zen, the samurai Zen, came over. But Susan, interested in do you introduce any of these koan, moves, aikido moves, if you will, in your therapy practice, which is pretty extensive. And by the way, I don't know if we mentioned it. Doug is a therapist, and Ewan is also a trained therapist.
So, two answers to that. One is I was just thinking of Dogen, and awakening is intimacy with all things. And I think that by its very nature will um, will erase boundaries and will erase hierarchy and erases gender. Because if you're really intimate with all things, there aren't divisions. So I see that a lot of the work we do now in university settings is on diversity, inclusion, and equality, and I feel that in many ways Dogen was at the forefront of that. Um, and then picking up on your question about using koans in therapy, I wrote a Psychology Today article expecting them to say this is weird. What are you thinking? This is bizarre. No, we're not going to publish this. Um, and John, I think I sent you the link for that so you can share it in the chat. They were very interested in it, and just to make it pithy, I was working with this lovely woman I'd seen for years who was in her 80s. Um, she fell, had a concussion, had vertigo, and was very confused and very frightened. And we were working on a koan in Monday night class. Um, and I shared that with her, and it's actually similar to one of the koans we were working with in our recent salon in terms of going into the darkness. And for her, that was a huge breakthrough because she felt that when we did the koan together, and this is someone who, by the way, is a Vipassana student, so uh, doesn't practice koans. She loved it because she felt so much less alone. She felt that I was accompanying her and the koan was accompany her through the darkness, through her confusion, and through her vertigo. And I'm not sure it actually made the vertigo um, subside, heal more quickly, but it gave her the sense that um, there was a community. I mean, there was care, there was companionship in that journey that had felt so alone. So I actually think koans can be a um, great vehicle for healing.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing about koans, sort of pirate koans, if you will. I have had a student for years who would bring it into her private therapy practice. She'd just throw out a koan, and how people responded, not knowing anything about meditation, anything about Zen, and how they were responding to it. I thought that was fascinating. Maybe that's a subject for another discussion. Doug, your square is lighting up.
Well, when Susan was talking, I remember a conversation that I had with David Weinstein a couple of years ago that put me onto something that I had not seen before, which is when a koan shows up, wherever it shows up, pay attention. And I've had what Susan just referred to happen frequently at this point, where I'll be in a therapeutic conversation with someone, and a koan will come up, and I'll mention that. I'll just ask, something just came to mind, and I'm wondering if we're at a place where I could share that with you. I pay real close attention to the response.
Mhm.
And then, I'm not going to say, oh, it's case whatever from the Blue Cliff record, but I'm gonna share the koan basically. And every single time something shifts that neither one of us had been aware of or saw coming. And I used to think, talk about how wise koans were, and how they call to us, and I'm I'm not too much in that kind of language for myself, but for better or worse, that's shifted for me,
Hmm.
because there's a wisdom that comes, whether you want to call it from the unconscious or collective unconscious, whatever you want to call it. There's something that comes up through koans that is really quite remarkable.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, meeting the inconceivable. Meeting the inconceivable. I love
yeah,
that
they're
phrase.
smarter and more creative than I am 9 times out of 10.
Ewan, I was asking you a little bit about are are you using koans in your Vipassana practice, your Vipassana teaching? And what do you think? Is there anything you can click and drag from your koan experience, which has become very rich and extensive in my mind, into
um,
Vipassana,
I
or never
don't.
the twain shall meet?
Um, I don't consider myself to be a Vipassana teacher. I don't think what I'm doing with the people who I spend time with when we meditate together, I don't think of it as Vipassana. Um, Mostly what I do when I'm teaching, and this is a roundabout way to answer your question, but I think I'll get there. Um, Mostly what I do is what Krishnamurti called choiceless awareness, which my first teacher also um, uh, called choiceless awareness. Just sitting, it would be called in Zen.
Hmm.
Um, and I put some words in occasionally, like, what are you noticing now? Um, what's going on? What are you thinking about? Something like that, um, into the room, into the Zoom room. And um, I've also put in everyone has their own light, just that part of that koan. And the coin lost in the river is found in the river, and in the group that I teach, they're all experienced meditators. They've all meditated for quite a while. There, some of them, a couple of them, have come back and said, what's what's that all about? And my recommendation is get hold of Bring Me the Rhinoceros, read it, and then, if you want to, then join PZI. So what am I using them for? How do they occur? They occur just because they come up when I'm sitting with a group. The koan comes up, so I put it into the room, and maybe, I don't know, it's a taster, it's an invitation to them to see what happens when those words come in when we're meditating together. And I never talk about them as koans except for when people ask me about what was that, and then I refer them to Bring Me the Rhinoceros,
Yeah,
which
yeah. To do so
knows
would be
more than I do.
to do so would be to add explanation, right? And I love that. Just to pile on meaning, which takes you away from the experience. I love that koan, which probably most people know on this call, where the teacher says, this is when there were plenty of rhinoceri around, but he says, bring me the rhinoceros fan. And the student says, well, it's broken. And so the teacher says, well, then bring me the rhinoceros, And that just fully sums up some of the stuff Susan and Doug, you were talking about, just embodying more of a show me rather than tell me, which exactly the way I interpret it, Ewan, when you come up with this little, unbidden nugget, coin lost in the river is found in the river, or step by step in the dark, if my foot's not wet, I found the stone, These are something that somehow flip us a little bit to experience the inconceivable, I think. Yeah. I want to say, if there are any questions from the audience, we'd love to hear from you. We can take whatever you might have. If you could type into the chat section, please do that. What do you think, Susan? We're now, gosh, I don't know, 50, 60, some would maybe say 100 years into bringing meditation into the Western world, these Asian teachings in the Western world. What do you think people today are looking for in meditation?
Oh, that is a long conversation, long
In 3
discussion.
volumes, please.
Yeah. Let me see if I can get it pithy, and it keeps changing. So, and Doug, you were probably interested in this as well, but one of the things I've seen in the insight centers is so many people are now trained in what we call MBIs, which are mindfulness-based interventions, which are MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, mindful self-compassion. At the hospital I'm working at, we now have one which is mindfulness for primary care, so people can help take their drugs. So there's been an influx of therapies of all sorts. Um, in fact, I heard a wonderful lecture today on someone at Brown University who has spent years researching how mindfulness can help lower blood pressure. And there's also mindfulness for relapse prevention. In fact, I heard Sharon Salzberg recently say, I've been told that nowadays you have to be a mindfulness-based therapist or nobody will want to see you. So that's one part of it. But then, of course, there's always a swing in the opposite direction. And I hear people saying, well, mindfulness is nice, but if you really have trauma or really have a complicated relationship with a parent, there's nothing like psychodynamic or psychoanalytic work to get at the heart. Otherwise, if you're just filling out worksheets, you're not really going to get to the heart of the difficulty. I'm not that black and white, um, but I'm just fascinated to see how therapy keeps changing. Um, so, Doug, I don't know what your thoughts are here.
Well,
I
I'm,
think what you're saying, Susan, is that meditation is changing therapy, and is therapy changing meditation? Yeah.
well, Susan, I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about what you see the thread, if you see a thread, through the development of the different psychotherapies in terms of what people are looking for. I mean, we've always lived in challenging times,
Mm.
and these seem to be particularly challenging. And so, are you seeing people that are coming in that, are having concerns about what's happening in Gaza, what's happening in the environment, what's happening in the political situation, etc.? And what are they asking for?
Well, great question, because one of the things I've been doing for the past decade is being a clinical liaison for people at the center who want some sort of therapy help. And I'm seeing everything in terms of um, alcohol addiction, drug addiction, psychosis, breakdowns, divorces. So basically, you name it, I think people are looking for support and comfort and also clear seeing and wisdom, as well as some joy and play. And I think as things get so hard externally, people are also forced to go inside and look at what they need, what's missing in their lives, what sort of life would they like to create that they don't have. So I think I don't think there's one answer, and I think it's very, very fluid.
John, when Susan just mentioned that, I recall you talking about uh, that koans they actually were born during horrific times in China.
Yeah, Peter Hershock talks a lot about that in his book Chan Buddhism, as you know, and the Mid Tang with the Anlushan rebellion. Uh, some estimates a third of the population to maybe more of the population uh, perished in famine and warfare and all that stuff. And that was the beginning of the golden age of Chan. So that Chan was received as a vessel, in these difficult times. And we talk a lot about that. You'll hear that about from John Tarrant on Sundays quite a bit, and we do talk about it on Mondays in our session. You know, um, this this world we cannot separate ourselves from the world of suffering and pain and difficulty, whether it's outside or inside. We have to take that all in our practice, and by doing that, I think some of our teaching is that um, there's some resolution that uh, the world, even its terrible bits, is not wrong. You know, even me, even my terrible bits are not wrong, and there's some relief in that, and even joy, as you say, Susan. Maybe a lot of joy sometimes because it's inconceivable. That's absolutely inconceivable. So, and how about you over in Sri Lanka? You've got some challenging environments over there. My gosh, people coming up to your door every day because the economy has collapsed, and they're looking for food, and you do bring them food.
Yeah, that's quite a big part of my life. The charity I run here. Um, Not sure I've got anything really to add. I mean, I think I've been critical of some aspects of Theravada and of um, Vipassana teaching, the ways I've been taught it by some people. Um, but it got me here, and I've no idea what role it played in that. Um, I have some, I'm not sure how to express this. I have a problem somehow with using mindfulness as therapy with, um, uh, but I don't know how to articulate that at the moment, I don't think. Um, try Again, I think it has to do with trying to make trying to have a goal and make myself feel better in some way. And obviously there's nothing wrong with feeling better, but in my own journey, I started off using meditation, I think largely to feel better. um, Zen practice koans take it deeper than that. It goes deeper than just um, end up kind of questioning everything, all of my feelings, getting to know all of them, knowing what they are, what it's like to be Ewan, in a way that when I was using it just to feel better, that wasn't happening, I don't think, because once I felt better, I kind of wasn't inquiring anymore. I'm not sure that made sense even to me, but that's my answer.
Yeah, I think that's great. This discussion too of inside world, outside world brings up this quality of, John Terrence said that Buddha nature is sort of like a microwave oven. It doesn't really have an opinion as to whether, things are good or things are bad this morning. Um, Yet the bodhisattva, spirit is that we wish to, this compassion arises naturally from this awakening. And how do we work with that? That is our individual choice. And this quality of compassion. I'm kind of interested, Susan. How about you? Your thoughts of compassion arising, selfless compassion, really arising from practice.
Well,
Yeah, just quickly, an
Yeah,
answer
yeah,
to the question that you
sure.
asked is um, uh, I find running the charity and answering the door. I made a vow a long time ago. Anybody who comes to my door, I give them something. Often it's not what they want, but uh, I find that really challenging, and that's really helpful in my practice. Um, Sorry, I've got a phone call coming in on my headphones, which makes it quite difficult to think at the same time.
Okay, if you have to duck out, Ewan, no worries. So
okay.
come on back.
I just want to respond to Ewan and then you, John. So Ewan, I do have to say, and I can tell you this one-on-one, that I agree with you in that mindfulness as therapy for me reduces um, the beauty and the richness of mindfulness. But one of the smartest quotes I've heard,
Can you repeat that, Susan?
sure, that
Mindfulness as therapy sort of deadens mindfulness as a
it's just one tiny
meditation.
piece of
Hmm.
mindfulness.
Okay.
I think it reduces mindfulness. But the smartest quote I've heard is something like going in search of brass. he discovered gold. So which I think is a useful way to look at it. Okay, you're just trying to get through the day without a panic attack. But then you start doing mindfulness and whoa, it leads you on a lifetime path. So I think to keep in mind we never know.
Mm, mm.
And I'm also just noticing um questions on the chat, so I don't want to ignore those. Um, but John, I think one of the wonderful things about compassion is, especially now when we really need it, how wonderful to have compassion, true compassion, arising out of practice
Mm.
or flourishing because of practice. So, but shall we look at
Yeah, let's look at a few questions. Alongside the teacher-student dynamic, um, let me see, how do koans affect sangha and relations among students? Do these relationships look different from those in the Theravadan context? Doug, how about you? How do koans affect the relationships in sangha?
Huh. I don't know. I think you'd have to ask my sangha. Um, I think there's a sense of, because we've got people who are working with koans and people who are not working with koans. But there's enough overlap. I mean, you can't be a part of our sangha without swimming around with koans, whether you're being intentional about it or not. And so I think there's some, and again, I can only speak for myself. For me, there's some sense of we're kind of all in this together. And there's an acceptance. For me, there's an interesting acceptance amongst people, whether they're doing koans or not doing koans. It's not like, oh, you should be doing koans because Doug loves koans. You should be not doing koans because Doug loves koans. There's I think there's not much of that kind of split. Again, you'd have to ask the Sangha about that. But
Mm.
I do think that there is some cohesion, whether you're working with a koan or you're not working with a koan, because the work itself creates a kind of acceptance and a kind of welcoming.
Yeah,
So if you
yeah.
come, if you're on sesshin with me and you're not working on koans, or you're working on koans, hopefully we're going to have an encounter that matters to both of us.
Yeah, yeah. And that's as a teacher of koans, that's increasingly has been my experience that whatever somebody brings in, it's not wrong, right? We're never outside the world of koans, and there's this sense of acceptance in that I think is very healthy for perhaps the whole community. Acceptance of that.
It's also one size doesn't fit all.
Yeah, yeah. Um, uh, Ewan, how about yourself? In your practices, would you define or how have you experienced mindfulness? In your practices, how would you define or how would you experience mindfulness?
I don't teach mindfulness anymore. I don't use the word.
Hmm.
In with my first teacher, it was explained and experienced as just knowing what's happening when you're washing the dishes. You feel the water, you see the bubbles, you have uh, have the experience you're having rather than being lost somewhere in thoughts or um, yeah. and that's how it was experienced. I mean, being mindful is knowing what's happening in a general sense.
In another question,
I wanted
thank you.
to, can I say a little thing
Please.
about Sangha? I
Yeah,
just
yeah,
wanted
yeah.
to say,
Please jump in.
I've got all these pictures on the screen, some of which are moving, most of which aren't because of the instability of me and my connection. And I don't know anything about most of the people on the screen, and yet since I joined PZI, I feel as if I really know and love a lot of the people I can see here through just sitting with them in the open temple and in retreat and so on. And that's a very interesting kind of intimacy for me. I see someone's face, someone's mushroom pops up into the open temple, and the first thing that happens is we both smile quite often with quite a lot of people, and I've no idea whether they're married, single, children, what job they do, where they live, anything like that. None of that is important. And that's a kind of Sangha, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. A question, is Buddhism not first at all a wisdom tool? So the focus of therapy, feeling better, the focus of emotional comfort may not well promote the connection to that wisdom. Any thoughts, Susan?
Yeah, I would just go back to the earlier point where you have, I agree with you. It's first of all a wisdom tool, but you have to start someplace. So again, looking for bronze, looking for brass, you hang in there and you can discover gold. So it's a process. And then also just because I run a little compulsive here, what book would you recommend for a beginner of koans? I would go with Mark Epstein's book. I would go with John's book, and I would go with Joan Sutherland's books. Those are
Well,
my
the titles of those are Zen and Therapy. Is
Zen
that?
of Therapy
Yeah,
is Mark Epstein's. Bring Me the Rhinoceros is John's, and Forest of Many Colors, I believe,
yeah. Through
is the
Force of Many
title
Colors. Yeah.
of
And
Joan.
I'd add Barry Magid's Nothing is Hidden along with that for a real different take on working with koans in the psychoanalytic tradition.
Mm-hmm.
Well, good. Are there any further things to say from the three teachers here? Please jump in if you have any final words.
I want to thank you for a wonderful and enlightening conversation. Oh,
My great pleasure.
It's been delightful to be with you all and to see. I see a whole bunch of people from PZI that I met, like Dan and other folks here who I've not seen face to face for a long time, and it's really great to see you all and a bunch of people from my sangha who infiltrated the crowd. Thank you very
Nice.
much. And Ewan, wonderful to meet you for the first time. And Susan, I will see you for coffee.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Ewan, and thank you, Doug, and thank you, Susan. And so nice to see you all. Thank you for coming. And go to pacificzen.org if you want to donate some money for year end, which is always very, very helpful for us.